as spring is here, according to the calendar at least. I know there might be another little snippet of some cold weather, but Friday was the first day of spring, according to our calendar. But I began to look out in western Kentucky, and any of you that's ever been there, there's a lot of rolling fields and a lot of farmland that is out there. And I began to think about, here as we're heading into spring and people will begin to plant gardens, begin to turn their ground and begin to plant things. Some of you all are good gardeners. Some of you, Roy Brooks back there, he'd go about anything. And he's enjoys gardening, enjoys putting out a garden, raising, bringing, giving to folks, canning and all that. But I began to look at those fields, and the Lord began to deal with me about planting and what is growing in our gardens. And I began to think about that just a little bit throughout the Word. Many times we know that in the Bible it speaks of planting and sowing and harvesting throughout the Bible. And I began to look at a little bit about planting and what's growing in our gardens. And you know, this morning I turned the television on, and I like to listen to a couple of guys early on Sunday morning. And I flipped over to a channel, and just as I got there, the guy began to talk about planting a seed. And I said, Lord, you just led me in the right direction, I guess. And I began to listen just a little bit about that, and it began to feed me just a little bit to what the Lord had laid upon my heart. What is growing in your garden? What is growing in your garden? So let's turn to 2 Corinthians, if you would, chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians. And we're going to read just a little bit here in Corinthians about what is in your garden, the writing of Paul. Chapter 10, 2 Corinthians, starting at verse 3. And the Word says this, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. I want to look at a couple of things here in Paul's writing about what is growing in your garden. We know that many times through the Word, he speaks of planting on good ground, solid ground, fertilizing and things like that, and the harvest that will come. But I'm going to look here just a little bit about what's growing in our gardens, and I want to look at strongholds and arguments and imagination, if you will. We want to look at it just a little bit about the thought that comes, the argument that comes, and the imagination in these strongholds. Many times when we begin to, I think back to when I was young, and my daddy was telling me about my grandfather one time that was an old coal miner up in Coxton, Kentucky, and he worked hard and he grew a garden. He had to grow a garden because he had to feed his young ones, had to feed the family, and he had to provide some way with some extra food. He didn't make a whole lot working in an old dog hole of a mine. He didn't make a lot of money. He was just worked out a tough living. But he was telling me, some of you know when I've mentioned the planting things in the signs. You know what I'm talking about? Some of you look at the almanac and you begin to look and you won't plant your beans until a certain time, because you got to make sure the signs are right. Otherwise, you'll come up maybe on the bad side of that. Some folks say, I don't believe in that stuff. Well, I tell you what I do. I'm just old-timey enough. Was raised in the country. Know that old-timers said, you better not plant your beans in this sign or that sign. Well, my grandpa, didn't heed to that advice. And my daddy said one spring he planted his beans and said one of the neighbors come by. My grandpa was an old man from over in Virginia, had an old-timey name. His name was Cossie, of all things. And said the neighbor come by and said, Cossie, your beans ain't going to amount to nothing. He said, how come? He said, you planted them in the wrong sign. Now, my grandpa said, I ain't nothing to that. Well, he planted his beans. My daddy said, boy, they sprouted out and the vines came and they began to bloom like crazy. He said they had the prettiest blooms he'd ever seen on his beans, but only one thing was missing. Not a single bean on the vines. So he had planted with good intentions, but something had gone afoul. Something had gone wrong and he didn't provide. It didn't come out with good, solid harvest of a return on his hard work of his investment. So what I'm trying to get at here, sometimes what we're planning sometimes turns out to be not so good. Look at what we're saying here about what's growing in your garden, the strongholds. What is a stronghold? It's something with a strong grip that possesses you. Many of us have strongholds in our lives, things that we need released from, things that need to come out of our lives so that our garden is growing solid, good vegetables, if you will, look at it that way, solid production of something that the harvest will be wonderful and good. Now, preacher, what you talking about? Whole lot of things in our lives that have a stronghold on us. You know, my preacher I was listening to this morning is talking about planting the seed. He said the problem is some folks are planting bad seeds and then they're eating the fruit of that bad seed. Think about that just a little bit. The strongholds that are in our lives that have control over us. What's in your garden today? Is there something keeping you from achieving and having the blessings of God and being in the center of God's will? Is there something in your life this morning? Is there a stronghold? For though we walk in the flesh, we don't war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God, pulling down those strongholds. If we will turn to Him and say, God, I've got to have a release. I've got to have a come out of this. You've got to take this from me. You've got to release me from this so that I can flourish. I can be in your favor. I can be in your will. I can be pleasing to you. Well, boys, good preaching, preacher, amen. Well, sometimes we just got to get on our knees and start calling out to the Lord. Whew, preacher, that's hard work. Yes, it is. It takes dedication and a devotion to call on the name of the Lord and say, God, I've got to have a release from this. This stronghold has got to go. Because I want God's blessings. I want God's will. I want what I'm harvesting, what I'm going to be productive and to be wonderful. I don't want a bunch of vines with blooms and no beans on them. I want something solid. Releasing of the stronghold. What's growing in your garden today? Is there a bunch of weeds? I remember one time, when I was at home, my daddy got this big idea that we cleaned the barn out over the winter time. We kept 3 or 4 horses. You know all what they leave for you. So my daddy made me and my brother, we was just great with a pitchfork and a shovel. We'd clean that barn stalls out, take them down under the garden spot. Well, I tell you what, we had it about that deep, all over the whole complete garden. Well, he got up there and turned it up. He said, now, buddy, when we have a garden this spring, he said, that out there will absolutely raise the stuff. Let me tell you what it raised. You could stand out there and watch the weeds break the ground. They would shoot up and I tell you what is this on the faces, you chop them down. I was like, we ain't never doing this again. Not never again. You know, a little bit is just right. Too much is just absolutely awful. I said, what was you thinking? He said, I don't know. I said, you wore me out. I wore 3 hole handles out that summer. We chopped, we cut. You couldn't keep it knocked down. I said, buddy, there's enough fertilizer on that to do the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, it would have grown anything. I don't care what you put in the ground. It'll come up. You got to be careful. You got to be careful. What's growing in your garden today?